and this was the main city that was behind the Canadian lines throughout 1918. With the German shelling, life was very intense here, so a lot of the men would go underground, and they lived in the caves underneath Arras, and in the basements, or the caves, in the areas around the Grand Place and the Petit Place. We're in the souterrain under the Hotel de Ville at Arras. It's a series of chambers that were built about the 16th century and were used by First World War troops to be safe from the Germans throughout the war. It held over 10,000 troops. It had a whole lighting system and water system. It was almost a home away from home.
I made my way to Arras and spent the night in one of the mysterious caves which lie under that city. It was a most curious abode. No one knows when the caves were dug. They were probably extended from time to time as the chalk was quarried for the purpose of building the town. Long passages stretched in different directions, and from them opened out huge vaulted chambers where the battalions were billeted.
General Currie doesn't let the Canadians rest in the city, but orders them right into action. Over battlefields where the cream of the British Army had been slaughtered in 1917, it now takes the Canadians 4 days of savage fighting in late August 1918 just to penetrate to the outworks of the Hindenburg Line.
Men were carrying out wounded on stretchers. I heard someone call my name. Going to where some wounded were lying, I saw Sadal. He looked up. "Tell me straight," he whispered. "Do you think I've got mine?" He was frightfully wounded, like the cases beside him. "I think you have," I said. "Is there anything I can do?" Sadal begged me to sit beside him till he went to sleep. It was a strange experience to sit there without talking and wait till he was gone. The men on the other 2 stretchers were both dead, and shortly, Sadal was too. Will Bird, 42nd Battalion.
On the first 2 days of the battle, August 26th and August 27th, the Canadians had advanced further in those 2 days than a whole British Army had advanced in 2 months in 1917. They were doing really well until they came up against the German positions on this ridge. And the Canadians were not ready for this. Their advance had outstripped their artillery, and once they got against these German positions, it was basically small groups of men advancing and really getting caught in the uncut barbed wire. It was the same problem that they had in the Somme in 1916. In the little valley over here, the 2nd Canadian Division was wiped out, and it literally became the graveyard of the 2nd Division.
Undaunted by such losses, the Canadians regroup for the attack. Their target is now a section of the Hindenburg Line called the Drocourt-Quéant, or DQ Line. A kilometer-thick barrier of dugouts, fortifications, trenches, and fields of barbed wire. Currie concentrates his men and guns at one slender point. His daring plan, punch a narrow hole through the German line and have his troops fan out behind the Germans once they have broken through. The attack begins. Scrambling right after the first wave of the Canadian assault is a fragile-looking signaller, Victor Wheeler. When Victor joined up, the doctors told him he wouldn't last 3 months. By now, with most of his friends already dead, Victor is a veteran of 2 years fighting.
Hitting the DQ line, we lost so many officers that many privates and NCOs were suddenly filling the breaches in the ranks. Of our 6 runners, only 1 survived. Signaller Scott was struck in the neck, and Charlie MacDonald's leg was blown off at the hip. But by 8:30 in the morning, after very heavy fighting, some of it hand to hand, we had captured the first 4 lines of the Drocourt-Quéant trench system and were within 440 yards of the town of Dury, our first objective.
This is a piece of the Drocourt-Quéant line. It's a spike from the First World War that somehow has surfaced through the mud after years and years of plowing in this field. This is an actual piece of the Drocourt-Quéant line, probably held the revetments in, or some of the little bridges they used to have over the top of the trenches. This is a Dury Mill cemetery. It was made right after the battle from all the bodies that were laying in the barbed wire and the men that were killed up here. As you can see by this cemetery and the fighting at the Drocourt-Quéant line, the Germans had by no way given up, and they were fighting a very hard battle, and they still had Cambrai to go. They had one more major battle. In fact, in the 60 days in August and September 1918, 1 in 5 of all the Canadians killed in the war were killed.
Breaking through the DQ line brings the Canadians close to their ultimate objective, the pivot of the German Army's supply system in France, the city of Cambrai, only 10 kilometers away. All along the Western Front, the German armies are in retreat. But the fighting has 60 days to go, and lying between the Canadians and Cambrai is the biggest single barrier of the Hindenburg Line. The heavily fortified, 20-meter wide Canal du Nord is the most treacherous obstacle the Canadians have ever faced. The Canal du Nord, a wide, peaceful waterway in the fertile agricultural plain of northern France, easily crossed now in a matter of seconds. But in late September 1918, it is the most dangerous obstacle on the Western Front. And it is this obstacle that the Canadians are poised to attack. So bold and so risky is Arthur Currie's plan to cross the canal that the British command, usually not adverse to sacrificing soldiers' lives, vetoes it. But Currie insists, and he prevails.
This canal at that time was water from here up and from about 2 miles down, but in this area it was dry. They hadn't finished the construction of the canal. This attack that the Canadians were going to do was probably the hardest that they threw at anybody during the whole war, at least the most complex, because they decided that the whole attack was going to be funneled through this dry part of the canal bed. And then everybody, which is about 60,000 troops, would have to fan out to attack other positions.
As we waited to cross the Canal du Nord, probably never in the war had we experienced a moment of deeper anxiety. The men would have to climb down one side of the canal, rush across it, and climb up the other. It seemed inevitable that the slaughter would be frightful.
They did the same thing as they did at Amiens. They had all their men hiding in the woods, and this was a deadly operation because if the Germans found them, gas shells and high explosive would have caused thousands of casualties. But anyway, Currie, who was the commander at that time, decided this is the attack he was going to make. And with a thundering barrage, the men stormed across the canal just where we're going right now. All across here, about 4,000 Canadian troops led the attack and pushed into these fields. Half of them went north to attack Marquion, and the other half pushed straight across the fields towards Bourlon.
Currie's boldness pays off. The Canadians rush the canal, punch through German defenses, and fan out north and south, heading for the final objective, Cambrai.
Shortly after crossing the canal, all officers in D Company became casualties. Soon there were so many casualties, we had to reorganize 2 companies on the spot. Badly battered as we were, we continued to drive forward into the hurricane while SOS messages went out for replacement officers. Corporal Victor Wheeler.
Well, the first stage of the battle had gone very well, and now they're just streaming through. The troops are just, the fields are full of the Canadians advancing. They're coming up to Bourlon Wood. Bourlon Wood had been destroyed in the fighting in 1917 when the British tried to capture it, and really they held on for a while but couldn't hold it. The Canadians just swept right by it. Troops went around it, both north and south, and troops also poured through it. So within about a day, Bourlon Wood and the village of Bourlon was in Canadian hands, and they're pushing the attack towards Cambrai. The problem occurred here was that after Bourlon, they outstripped their artillery again, and they're going against German defenses on the outskirts of Cambrai that they really don't know anything about, whether they're slit trenches or machine guns or barbed wire. They have no real idea of what's facing them. So Bourlon was part of the successful 2 days after clearing the Canal du Nord, but they're going to run into a lot more trouble as they close in on the suburbs, the little villages around Cambrai. The Canadian Corps on 27 September 1918 forced the Canal du Nord and captured this hill. They took Cambrai, Denain, Valenciennes, and Mons.
Canon Scott is with the troops, as in a dozen days of non-stop and exceptionally bitter fighting, they slowly drive the Germans back across the fields, pausing only at night.
In the morning, I went back again to our men in the line. The country was undulating, and German machine gun emplacements were in all directions, and our men suffered very severely.
In just the first day, after storming across the Canal du Nord, the Canadians had advanced more than 4 kilometers and lost thousands of men.
Private G. Elport, Royal Canadian Regiment, 28 September 1918, age 22. He did his best. Private G. Burton, 52nd Battalion, Canadian Infantry, 28 September 1918, age 31. He fought with heroes side by side. He died that we might live, ever remembered. The fighting on September the 27th had broken the Canal du Nord line and the German Marquion line, and the Canadians had stormed through Bourlon Wood over here, and they were crossing these fields going towards Cambrai. On the 28th, new troops came up to relieve the tired ones, and they continued their attack against the German position called the Marcoing Line. The Marcoing Line was a trench system, not too elaborate, lots of barbed wire that ran from these villages across this little valley here and into these small villages that are really suburbs of Cambrai. From here, the Canadians could actually see Cambrai. And if you can imagine, on the 28th of September, from this church over here, all the way across to the factory buildings on the Douai Road, the Canadians were assaulting on the German positions. The problem was the Germans were inside these little villages here, and they had fortified all the villages, and they put up barbed wire, and basically the Canadians didn't know where they were. They didn't have the proper maps or reconnaissance to help them with the attack. They had outstripped a lot of their artillery, and now it was getting very difficult for them to break through to Cambrai. And in fact, this is where Canon Scott's war ends, where he's watching the spires of Cambrai like we are now, and he's actually wounded. And that's the end of him for the war.
Suddenly, there was a tremendous crash in front of us. A lot of earth was blown into our faces, and we both fell down. I'd been wounded in both legs, and from one I saw blood streaming down from my buddies. The chaplain of the 10th Battalion, who happened to be standing in the sunken road, got some men together quickly and came out to our help. I was carried off immediately to an ambulance in the road and placed in it with 4 others, one of whom was dying.